Hey guys, Gerald here again for another free tutorial. So in this video, what I've decided to do is show you my workflow, or more of a hack, to how I actually create a somewhat detailed and realistic head using a series of tricks with pictures as well as a screenshot from Sketchfab. So what I'm starting with is actually a quick line sketch of the character, and I have an image of an actor pulled up just to give me a guide of how I want his portions of this elf-like character to be. And I personally like to have a real photo reference when I work for a character sketch like this, just so that I have all of the visual landmarks covered. So just a little disclaimer, this video was sped up, I believe, at about 3 times the speed. So the total duration of this may have been about an hour or less than an hour. But I figured you'll still get to see like the core workflows that I've applied to create this portrait painting or digital montage, however you want to call it. So for me, the line sketch is important because it's still the quickest way to capture the personality, feeling, and character of the head design or the portrait design. And in this case, I want a somewhat flamboyant, confident, cocky, elf-like character. I did drew him with the neck down to the collar, but in the demo, I only actually painted down to his neck. But you could easily just apply the same workflow throughout the rest of the body. So I'm not going into too clean of a line art. As you can see, it's relatively loose because what I'm concerned about is more of the general idea and design of his feeling. So now I'm going into Sketchfab and I'm loading up a nice blank head model, one of those default head sculpts. And I'm matching the angle of the Sketchfab model along with the lighting direction, matching it to my sketch. This way I get a nice similar angle screenshot of the 3D model, which I'll then use in my painting process. So here is the match sketch, and I'm going to supplement this with a nice 3D rendered head. I believe that was from Arkham Knight, as well as any other relevant photo textures, ideally in a similar or close angle. So this is where the hack really begins. The first step is essentially cutting out the gray model, and this screenshot from Sketchfab is going to serve as my lighting model. So it has all of that wonderful shadow and light information. And all I need to do is just use Liquify and carefully nudge the screenshot to match with my line art. And what I'm looking for is all of the key forms lining up with my sketch. So generally, I would take my time with this. I wouldn't really rush this stage, and you might have to switch off the overlay every now and then just to make sure that you get a good representation of the head, because it's quite easy to maybe over liquefy the head to the point where it becomes too lumpy or misshaped. So as you can see here, I've switched off the line art so I get a better look at how the underhead is being shaped. And I want to make sure that the feeling overlaps with my sketch. So I'm going to stress that this is quite a hack, right? Because you could technically paint this from scratch, but it is kind of a fun workaround if you want to get things done a bit quicker. So next, what I'm going to look for is another Sketchfab head. And for this second head, I don't need any lighting information. All I want is actually texture information. So if you look at this head sculpt or this head model, there's a lot of micro wrinkles and really nice skin textures applied to this model. And what I want is a clean screenshot of this texture minus any lighting and shadow. So same as before, the angle of this screenshot is lining up with my sketch. And I'm going to roughly match the position before again heading to liquify, putting my sketch on top, and once again using the liquify tool and just repositioning all of the core landmarks or the features to line up with my sketch. Now, it might seem really strange at first, especially if you're doing this for the first time. And I'm not surprised as well as that you might have to do this maybe once or twice, because it is easy to get carried away with the liquify. You might do too much or you might do too little. So my advice is just really take your time with this, because you will be saving a lot of time anyway in the painting process by doing this art hack. So I've switched off the line art just to see how the face is shaping up. And I was telling my friends that this kind of looks like Quentin Tarantino, but which is not a bad thing, which means that it's actually starting to look like a person. So now that we have our line sketch, our skin texture pass, and our shadow and light pass, we can start to modify them to start the actual building process. So what I'm creating here is a reflection or specular pass. Essentially, it's just the skin tones desaturated and made to contrast and added as a screen. So once you multiply the shadow pass over the texture layer, you can see how the new shadow shapes line up with your under texture, giving you essentially instant shadow and instant lighting to what was prior rather flat image. You can see here if I switch off the shadow pass, it's just a flat face with no lighting information and no shadow information. So for the neck, I'm just extending the colors and just painting over and filling it up. Of course, you can use a similar texture or screenshot to fill that up, but I figured that just for the sake of this demo, I was just going to paint it in. So by color picking the values of this shadow pass, it's quite easy for me to define how intense and how dark the shadow colors are supposed to be for this layer. So I'm constantly checking the piece by switching the multiply layer back on and off, as well as adding anything that was missing in our previous screenshot. So there was no ear prior to this, so I'm bringing the ear back in by cutting and pasting it and flipping it across. And I'm hand painting the shadow pass for the screen left ear. So now that I have both layers somewhat overlapped and aligned, I still want them to get a little bit more precise. So I'm going into the separate layers now and doing another liquify pass just to make sure that I get all of those small nooks and crannies and changes in form correct. So by now we're somewhat at the 20-minute mark in real time, or in this sped up version it's about 10 minutes. So in real time I was about 20, maybe 30 minutes in. And you can see that the head is coming along really well. There's a lot of good fundamental lighting applied. There's a clear cast shadow. And what I'm adding now, I'm painting in now, is just a rim light. You can see the Robert Pattinson reference on the left there, I'm just emulating the same rim light, but I'm painting this in myself this time. But I find this a really fun way to get portraits done really quickly, because it was something that I've always personally struggled with when it comes to character work. And to me, this is a nice way to start your rough painting or your rough concept, um, to give yourself a really good base before you actually start to paint it manually later, right? By finishing it with your own details and your own paint work. I find it a great way for people who are just starting out with digital art. I think the character portrait is one of those things that people are attracted to and they really enjoy creating. But getting the lighting right for me has always been a challenge. So I hope this little hack could help some of you out there to create more convincing lighting on your portraits works. So with that added rim light, you can see how the 3D geometry or the form of the heads becomes much more defined. It's always nice to have at least two lights, one main light and one fill light in your work. So now what I'm doing is I'm going to just repaint the eyes in, because I definitely want the character to be looking at the camera. To me, that's something I find more attractive when it comes to painting portraits. I like to start by just locking down the shape of the eyeball itself, just making sure I get the curvature and the values right. And I'm constantly going back and forth with my shadow paths just to make sure it looks appropriate. And I'm also tweaking my shadow paths manually, because these Sketchfab screenshots are great, but they are no way perfect, right? Because they are still using a rudimentary real-time engine to give you the lighting and shadow information. Definitely, if you want it to be more polished, you still have to work on top of it. You still have to put in your own understanding of lighting, but you're saving a ton of time. So that's exactly what I'm doing now. I'm just cleaning up the shadow paths, darkening and softening certain areas, and I'm using this particular 3D model as the base for the new eye. And I like how it's looking towards the camera, but I'm just going to tweak it a little bit so that the perspective lines up. Again, you could hand paint this if you want. For me, I just wanted you to see how I would do it if the request was to make it as photoreal as possible within a short period of time. So I'm actually working in this eye photograph into the texture layer itself, and just keep hitting it with a little bit of paint, a little bit of cleanup, just to make sure that the angle and perspective of it lines up. Because it's one thing to just drop a picture, it's another thing to make sure it lines up with the rest of your artwork. I'm gonna grab the eyebrow from this particular texture. It has a very nice, sharp, elf-like eyebrow shape, which I thought was quite fitting. And I'm just using hue and saturation levels and a bit of transparency to match the hue and perspective and values of these two textures. So since the edges of the textures are really harsh, after I color correct this, I'm just going to use a soft airbrush and kind of remove or feather off those edges so that there's a cleaner blend. But it's always much easier when you first tweak the colors and the values. So now that the eyebrows are done, I'm just going through the entire base, skin texture, and sharpening some of the details, as well as copying over additional textures, any sort of texture that I think would help give additional definition to this character. So for example, if I was doing a older character, then I would put more care putting in the crow's feet wrinkles or the eye bags, just making sure that the correct level of definition and surface texture is added. Because my shadow pass is essentially on top of everything, no matter what texture I put in, the lighting will always be intact. And I thought this was a very fun way to work because I can purely focus on addressing all of the details and not be worried about whether the lighting or whether I had to redo any of the lighting or shadow. So same like the eye and the eyebrows, the way I'm adding this surface information, which is the slight stubble on this jawline and a little bit more of the skin pore information. I first adjust the perspective using the warp tool, warp transform tool, adjust the hues, levels, transparency, and then just start to erase the layer to soften the edges. So at this point of the painting, almost everything that I want to address is already in there. If this was a rough concept that I wanted to share to my client, just to show them, hey, this is where I'm taking the character. What do you think about this design? It gives me a much higher chance of approval or at least positive feedback because the lighting's in place, the textures are in place, but the personality is present. And my client can give me a really good assessment of what they think of my submission. And it doesn't take me a lot of time because this is about 30, 45 minutes worth of work and I can get a lot of information in. So once I get the okay for something rough and crude like this, I can spend as much time as I need to manually polish this up by painting it in and working in all of the handcrafted details to finish the said illustration. So I'm adding small touches like subsurface scattering, which is the warmness of the skin when it gets hit by the light. And I'm doing a quick check on my sketch as well. I'm not really trying to exactly line up the sketch because for me, I tend to sketch more exaggerated than I really want because my sketches tend to reflect that. They're a little bit more angular because the way that I draw. For me, a sketch is just a quick way to vomit ideas. I don't necessarily follow them to a T. I just want to capture the feeling. And if I can continue or carry that feeling over to the refined version or the color version, that sketch would have done its job. So I'm working in just with a small paintbrush, any sort of refinements and micro changes in the light. I've actually copied all the layers and merged it because I just personally prefer doing this stage on a merge layer. Because at this point, I'm very much happy with the light and values. And I'm only addressing the balancing issues like how intense certain parts should be, or how light or reflective certain parts should be according to just my personal artistic preference. So once again, you can easily take this over and repaint it, and you'll get an excellent base for your paintings if you're working on the illustration and whatnot. Besides using Sketchfab, you can also use a software like DAZ Poser, to grab a head and maybe set up some simple lights, like a complicated light setup, maybe like a bottom light or a side lighting. And you could apply the same workflow, meaning just acquiring the shadow and light paths and liquefying it to align with your line sketch. So that last bit of liquefy was just to make sure that I was hitting a little bit more landmarks of my original sketch. So I just pulled a little bit more of his bone features, exaggerated them slightly, just to make sure that they line up with the original sketch further. Adding a bit of an unsharp mask just to tie everything together, and a bit of color correction just to make sure that I get the actual colors that I want, as well as a little bit of a levels adjustment to balance out the values. So as I'm wrapping up now, you can see the general structure of it. We started with a line sketch, and it captures the feeling, I guess. For me, that's the most important thing. Like, who is this character? What is the general feeling that I get from it? And then we use the hack, which is cheating with the 3D screenshots, as well as the 3D skin textures. And then we started to work in our own lights to make the forms more readable and interesting, as well as painting in or photo bashing in additional features and details like the eye and additional skin details. So I've done this technique several times on several different instances. You can really create a wide range of characters, not just something like this. So you're gonna see other samples that I did with the older character done in the exact same way, and also a little bonus Thanos piece that I did for my students. So I hope you learned something in this video, and I hope you find my channel useful. If you thought this video was good, please like and subscribe, and tune in for my next updates. Thank you.